She stood shivering in the doorway of a cabin, smelling of pine and dried blood, her wedding dress heavy with trail dust. She hadn't come for love. She'd come for survival. But as the firelight caught the massive, scarred silhouette of the man she had married sight unseen, the silence between them stretched tight enough to snap. Lydia set her jaw, unbuttoned her collar, and asked the one question that could break him. Or make them. The wagon driver hadn't even waited for her to grab her trunk before he tipped his hat, whipped the mules, and rattled back down the mountain pass. Lydia Bowman stood alone in the biting wind of the Wyoming Territory, a solitary dark smudge against an ocean of blinding white snow and grey rock. She was 28, a widow of a man who had left her with nothing but debts, a bruised jaw, and a profound understanding of how little a woman's life was worth in St. Louis. The letters had been brief, pragmatic. I have a cabin, I have food. I need a wife to keep the hearth and help with the pelts. I do not drink. That last sentence was the one that had convinced her to sign her name to the marriage contract and board a train heading west. The door of the cabin opened. Gideon Hayes stepped out. He was exactly what the mountain demanded a man to be: massive, broad-shouldered, and entirely stripped of softness. He wore buckskin pants, stained dark at the knees, and a heavy wool coat. His beard was thick, threaded with premature grey, and his hair hung past his ears. But it was his eyes that made Lydia's breath hitch. They weren't the hard, predatory eyes she was used to. They were the colour of river stones under shallow water. Quiet, watchful, wary. "You're Lydia," he said. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used in weeks. It was a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the frozen air. "I am." Lydia gripped the handles of her worn carpetbag. She didn't smile. She had no smiles left to fake. "You're Gideon." He nodded once. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't ask about the journey. He simply walked past her, effortlessly hoisted her heavy wooden trunk onto his right shoulder, as if it weighed no more than a bundle of kindling, and gestured toward the open door with his free hand. The inside of the cabin was a single, large room. It was aggressively utilitarian. A cast-iron stove radiated a fierce, blistering heat in the center. Bundles of dried herbs and salted meats hung from the rafters. A heavy oak table sat near a window, and in the far corner, tucked beneath the sloping roof, was a single bed covered in a thick patchwork quilt and several heavy animal skins. Lydia looked at the bed. Then she looked away. "You can put your things by the wall," Gideon said, setting the trunk down with a dull thud. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, wiping his massive, calloused hands on his thighs. "Stew's hot. Elk. Potatoes if you want 'em." "Thank you." Lydia took off her coat. Underneath, she wore a simple, dark blue dress. It was her best dress, the one she had chosen to be married in, though the ceremony had been nothing more than a quick signature with a bored magistrate in the valley town 3 days ago. Gideon watched her for a split second before averting his gaze to the cast-iron stove. He moved to it, grabbing a thick iron poker and unnecessarily jabbing at the glowing coals. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Back east, silence meant anger. It meant a blow was coming. Here, Lydia realized as she mechanically chewed the rich, gamey meat, the silence was just the natural state of things. The mountain didn't speak, and neither did Gideon. She watched him from across the rough-hewn table. His hands were fascinating. They were scarred, the knuckles thick, the skin weathered to the texture of saddle leather. These were hands that killed things, hands that skinned hides and built cabins and swung axes. But as he held his tin spoon, his movements were surprisingly deliberate, almost gentle, as if he were overly conscious of his own strength and terrified of breaking the fragile tin. "Is the winter always this early?" Lydia asked, her voice cracking slightly from disuse. Gideon looked up. He seemed startled that she had spoken. "Usually comes by late October, sometimes earlier. We got snowed in till May last year." "We? Me? The dogs?" He nodded toward the corner where two large, wolfish dogs lay curled together, their eyes tracking Lydia's every movement. "Lost one to a cougar in January. Just the two now." Lydia swallowed. The reality of her situation was settling heavy in her gut. She was trapped on top of the world with a stranger, two half-wild dogs and a single bed. She had traded the cruel noise of the city for the terrifying isolation of the wild. "I can cook," Lydia said, feeling the sudden need to justify her presence, to prove the transaction was sound. "I can mend. I know how to process meat. I won't be a burden." Gideon's brow furrowed. He set his spoon down. "Didn't ask you to be a servant, Lydia. Asked for a wife." The word hung in the air. Wife. It was a heavy, loaded word. To Lydia, it meant duty. It meant enduring the dark hours of the night. It meant spreading her legs in the dark and counting the wooden beams on the ceiling until the man was done groaning and rolling over. She had done it before. She could do it again. She had survived worse men than Gideon Hayes appeared to be. "I know what you asked for," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any romantic pretense. "I'm here." Gideon didn't reply. He stood up, taking their empty bowls to a wash basin. He kept his back to her. The tension in the small cabin was beginning to thicken, mingling with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. The sun had completely dipped behind the jagged peaks outside, plunging the wilderness into a deep, bruised, purple twilight. Night was here. The time for transactions was ending. The time for the reality of their contract was beginning. The wind picked up around 8 o'clock. It didn't just blow, it battered the cabin walls like a physical entity trying to break in. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed. Lydia sat on the edge of the single bed. She had changed into a white cotton nightgown behind a canvas screen Gideon had hastily erected near the stove. The nightgown was worn thin at the elbows, but it was clean. She ran a bone comb through her long, dark hair, staring at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror propped on a barrel. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her cheekbones were sharp from years of scraping by on too little food and too much worry. Gideon was avoiding her. It was obvious. For the past hour, he had found every excuse to stay away from the corner of the room where the bed sat. He had checked the door hinges. He had added 3 logs to the fire, making the cabin almost stiflingly hot. He had meticulously cleaned his rifle, oiling the barrel with a rag until it gleamed. Now he was sitting by the hearth, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone. Shk, shk, shk. The rhythmic sound of steel on stone was grating on Lydia's frayed nerves. She knew how this worked. She knew the stalling. Men were either brutal in their haste or clumsy in their hesitation. She preferred to just get it over with. The anticipation was always worse than the act itself. She put the comb down. "Gideon." The scraping stopped. He didn't turn around, but she saw the muscles in his broad back tense beneath his flannel shirt. "Yeah? The fire is fine. Your knife is sharp. It's late." He sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he set the knife and the whetstone down on the hearth. He stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, a nervous tic she was already beginning to recognize. He turned to face her. In the dim, flickering orange light, he looked terrifyingly large. a wild man of the woods. Yet, as he took a tentative step toward the bed, he looked like a man walking to the gallows. He stopped about 4 feet away, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. "I can take the floor," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "If you need time. If you ain't ready." Lydia let out a short, humorless breath. She looked down at her hands, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. "We signed the paper, Gideon. I ate your food. I sleep under your roof. I know what the bargain is." "It ain't just a bargain," he muttered, looking at the floorboards. "Isn't it?" She looked up, her gaze cynical and sharp. "Let's not dress it up in lace, Gideon. You bought a wife because it gets lonely up here, and a man has needs. I sold myself because I was starving and tired of being beaten by men who didn't even have the decency to feed me first. We made a trade. I'm ready to pay my end." He flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a tightening of the jaw and a subtle shift in his shoulders, but Lydia caught it. It confused her. She had expected anger at her bluntness. She had expected him to step forward and aggressively assert his rights. She hadn't expected him to look gutted. He swallowed hard. "I ain't gonna beat you, Lydia. Ever." "I know," she said softly, and surprisingly she meant it. "But the rest of it, we have to do the rest of it." Gideon didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the quilt covering her knees. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desperate sound. Lydia sighed. The stalling was making her anxious. She decided to strip away the last remaining veneer of propriety. If they were going to do this, she needed to know exactly what kind of night she was in for. She needed to know if she had to brace herself, or if she could just check out and let her mind wander while his body did the work. She looked him dead in the eye. "Can you make me come tonight?" The words dropped into the quiet cabin like a lead weight. Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes widened, flashing with a sudden, intense panic. He looked as if she had just pulled a gun on him. The blood rushed out of his face, leaving his weather-beaten skin a pale, sickly color. "What?" he breathed. Lydia kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You heard me. I'm asking if you know what you're doing, or if this is just going to be 10 minutes of heavy breathing while I stare at the ceiling and wait for you to roll over." Gideon opened his mouth, closed it. He took a half-step back, his massive hands opening and closing at his sides. He looked entirely cornered. The apex predator of the Rocky Mountains had been utterly paralyzed by a woman in a cotton nightgown. "Lydia, He choked on the words. He rubbed a trembling hand over his face, dragging his fingers through his thick beard. "It's a simple question, Gideon." He looked at her, his Riverstone eyes wide, vulnerable, and completely stripped of any masculine bravado. The silence stretched again. But this time, it wasn't the natural silence of the mountain. It was the agonizing silence of a man facing his deepest inadequacy. He dropped his gaze back to his boots. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she barely heard it over the wind. I don't know how." Lydia blinked. "You don't know what I like?" "No." He squeezed his eyes shut, a flush of deep, humiliated red creeping up from his heavy collar to the tips of his ears. "I don't know how to do any of it. Lydia, I've never—" He swallowed convulsively. "I've never been with a woman." Lydia sat perfectly still. The cynical armor she had worn for years cracked straight down the middle. 32 years old, a mountain man who hunted bear with a rifle and butchered elk with a knife. And he was a virgin. Lydia stared at him. She looked for the lie, for the cruel joke. But there was nothing in Gideon's posture but pure, excruciating shame. He was a giant of a man, built for survival in the harshest environment on Earth, currently shrinking into himself as if trying to disappear into the rough-hewn floorboards. "Never?" Lydia whispered, the harsh edge completely gone from her voice. He shook his head slowly, keeping his eyes firmly squeezed shut. "Lived up here with my pa since I was 12. He died 5 years back. Only time I go to town is to trade pelts for flour and powder. Never had the money for women in town. Never had the words for the decent ones." He let out a ragged breath. "I'm sorry. You asked for a man and you got a damn fool." Lydia felt a strange sensation blooming in her chest. It was a tightness, but not the panic she was used to. It was a sudden, fierce ache of empathy. She had spent her entire adult life navigating the selfish, brutal desires of men. She had learned to map their lust, to dodge their anger, to commodify her own body just to keep a roof over her head. She knew how to survive a predator. She didn't know what to do with a man who was terrified of breaking her. "Gideon, look at me." He shook his head. "I'll take the floor." "Gideon Hayes, open your eyes and look at me." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of authority. Slowly, agonizingly, he opened his eyes. They were bright, glistening in the firelight. He looked terrified. Lydia shifted on the bed, patting the mattress beside her. "Sit down." He hesitated, glancing at the small space beside her as if it were a bear trap. But he obeyed. He moved stiffly, lowering his massive frame onto the edge of the mattress. The bed springs groaned under his weight. He kept a solid foot of distance between them, sitting rigidly upright, his hands clamped on his knees. "You thought I'd be angry?" she asked quietly. "I figured you'd think less of me. A man my age." Lydia let out a small, tired laugh. It wasn't a mocking sound. It was a sound of immense relief. "The men I've known who had the most experience were the ones who left the deepest bruises. Experience just meant they knew exactly how to take what they wanted without caring what it cost the woman." He turned his head slightly, looking at her profile. "You wrote to me," she continued, looking down at her hands. "You asked for a wife. You paid my debts back east. You bought my train ticket. Why?" "I was lonely," he said, the honesty brutal and plain. "Winter gets dark. The silence gets too loud in your head. I wanted a voice in the cabin. I wanted someone to share the fire with." He paused. "And I wanted a wife, the way a man wants a wife. But I don't know how to start. I don't know what to do with my hands." Lydia turned to him. The proximity was startling. She could smell wood smoke, pine needles, and the clean, sharp scent of cold air on his skin. He was trembling. This massive, lethal man was shaking beside her. "Do you want me, Gideon?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. He swallowed. "More than I ever wanted anything in my life." The utter lack of artifice disarmed her completely. There were no games here, no power plays, just two damaged, lonely people at the edge of the world. Lydia realized then that the script she had prepared for tonight was entirely useless. She couldn't just check out. She couldn't just endure. For the first time in her life, she wasn't prey. She was a partner. "Then I'll show you," Lydia said. She reached out. Gideon flinched slightly as her small, pale hand hovered near him, but he forced himself to stay still. She gently laid her fingers over his massive knuckles, resting on his knee. His skin was rough, scarred with old nicks and calluses, but it was incredibly warm. "It's not a fight, Gideon," she whispered. "It's not a hunt. You don't have to conquer anything." She slid her hand up his arm, feeling the thick, corded muscle beneath his flannel shirt. She moved to the buttons at his collar. His breathing hitched, shallow and fast, like a panicked animal. Lydia unfastened the first button, then the second. "Breathe," she instructed softly. He exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you, Lydia. I'm too big, I'm clumsy. You won't hurt me." She pulled the shirt open, revealing a chest covered in dark hair and a smattering of faded scars. She placed her palm flat against his bare skin, right over his heart. It was hammering frantically against her palm. "Feel that? We're both scared. It's okay." Gideon looked down at her hand on his chest, then up into her eyes. The raw gratitude in his expression made Lydia's throat tighten. "Put your hand on my waist," she guided him. He raised a trembling hand, hesitating in the air before slowly, agonizingly slowly, bringing it down to rest on the curve of her hip through the thin cotton nightgown. His hand was so large it spanned her entire side. His touch was incredibly light, as if he were handling spun glass. "A little firmer," she encouraged, covering his hand with hers and pressing it gently against her body. "I'm not going to break." Gideon let out a low groan, a sound born of years of suppressed longing and sudden, overwhelming tactile sensation. He closed his eyes, his thumb nervously stroking the fabric over her hip bone. Lydia shifted closer, bridging the gap between them. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his thick, soft beard, and guided his face down toward hers. She didn't rush. She let him feel the warmth of her breath, let him adjust to the proximity. When their lips finally met, it wasn't a collision of passion. It was a question. Gideon remained entirely still for a second, absorbing the shock of contact. Then, very slowly, his mouth softened against hers. He didn't push, he didn't demand. He simply yielded to the sensation, letting Lydia set the pace. It was clumsy, hesitant, and entirely beautiful. When she pulled back slightly, Gideon's eyes were dark, dilated in the dim light. "You're doing just fine," she whispered, a genuine warm smile finally touching her lips. Lydia realized, as she helped him pull his heavy flannel shirt over his shoulders, that the cynical transaction she had prepared for was gone. In its place was something terrifyingly real. They were in uncharted territory, blind and stumbling. But for the first time in Lydia's life, she wasn't walking it alone. She guided his calloused hands to her shoulders, shivering not from the cold, but from the sudden, profound heat of being touched by a man who actually saw her. Lydia woke to the sharp, bitter smell of chicory coffee and the rhythmic, hollow thwack of an axe outside. The air in the cabin was frigid, stinging the tip of her nose, but beneath the mountain of heavy furs and the patchwork quilt, she was sweltering. She lay perfectly still, staring at the raw pine beams of the ceiling. Her body ached. It was a deep, unfamiliar soreness. It wasn't the sharp, terrified tension that used to lock her jaw and knot her shoulders for days in St. Louis. It wasn't the bruised, hollowed-out feeling of surviving a man's temper. This was a heavy, grounding fatigue. The physical evidence of a long night spent teaching a giant how to be gentle. She turned her head. The space beside her was empty, the sheets already cold. Habitual panic flared in her chest for a fraction of a second before the memories rushed back, extinguishing the fear like water over a match. Gideon, the sheer, overwhelming bulk of him, trembling over her in the dark. The way he had kept pausing, his breathing ragged, whispering into her hair. "Is this all right? Lydia, am I hurting you?" He hadn't hurt her. He'd been so utterly terrified of his own strength that Lydia had been forced to pull his hips down, to dig her nails into his broad shoulders, to silently demand that he stop treating her like spun glass. It hadn't been a polished, seamless affair. It was messy. It was awkward. It was interrupted by fumbled limbs, whispered directions, and Gideon's profound, breathless apologies every time he thought he shifted his weight too heavily. But when he had finally surrendered to it, burying his face in the crook of her neck with a deep, tearing groan, Lydia had felt a strange, quiet victory. She hadn't just endured. She had guided. She had given a lonely man a piece of humanity he had convinced himself he didn't deserve, and in return he had given her safety. Absolute, unwavering safety. Lydia pushed the heavy furs back and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The cold air raised goosebumps on her bare arms. She pulled on her thick woolen stockings and her day dress, moving slowly. The door unlatched. Gideon stepped inside, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air with him. He was carrying an enormous armful of split logs. His beard was dusted with frost, his cheeks ruddy from the biting wind. He kicked the door shut with his boot and turned toward the woodbox. He froze when he saw her standing by the bed. The logs tumbled from his arms, clattering violently into the wooden crate. Gideon wiped his gloved hands on his thighs, his gaze dropping instantly to the floorboards. The fearsome mountain man, capable of surviving a brutal Wyoming winter, single-handedly, looked entirely ready to bolt back out into the snow. "Morning," Lydia said. Her voice was husky with sleep. Gideon swallowed hard. "Morning." He took off his heavy leather gloves, tucking them under his arm. He couldn't seem to figure out what to do with his hands. "I made coffee. It's on the stove. I can fry some bacon if you're hungry." "Coffee is fine." Lydia walked across the room. Gideon noticeably tensed as she approached, his massive frame going rigid. He was bracing himself. For what? Lydia wasn't entirely sure. Regret? A harsh word. She stopped in front of the cast-iron stove, picked up a rag to protect her hand, and poured the thick, black liquid into a tin cup. She took a sip. It was awful, bitter and strong enough to strip paint. "You chopped a lot of wood," she noted, looking out the frosted window at the massive pile of fresh kindling stacked against the glass. Gideon rubbed the back of his neck, his knuckles white. "Woke up early. Didn't want to wake you. Figured the cold was coming fast, so I got to chopping." He was overcompensating. The sheer volume of wood outside was the physical manifestation of his nervous energy. Lydia set her tin cup down on the table. She turned to face him, leaning her hip against the heavy oak wood. "Look at me, Gideon." He slowly brought his eyes up to meet hers. The riverstone grey was filled with a frantic, silent question. "Did I ruin this? Are you packing your trunk?" "I'm not fragile," Lydia said softly, deliberately holding his gaze. "And I'm not leaving." The breath Gideon let out seemed to empty his entire chest. His shoulders dropped 3 inches. He closed his eyes for a brief second, nodding slowly. "I didn't know," he mumbled, his voice thick. "I didn't know it was going to be like that. I thought I was too heavy, too rough." Lydia walked the 2 steps separating them. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and placed her hands flat against his chest, right over his heavy wool coat. He was solid as a rock wall. "You were exactly what you needed to be," she said. Gideon looked down at her hands. Slowly, cautiously, he raised his own massive hands and placed them over hers. He didn't pull her into a tight embrace. He just held her hands against his chest, grounding himself in the reality of her touch. "I'll get better at it," he promised, the earnestness in his voice breaking Lydia's heart a little. "I learn fast, Lydia. I swear I do." A genuine, startling laugh bubbled up in Lydia's throat. It was the first time she had laughed out loud in nearly 3 years, The sound bounced off the pine walls, bright and clear. Gideon looked startled. Then a slow, hesitant smile cracked through his thick beard, changing his entire face. He looked younger. He looked lighter. "I know you do, Gideon," she smiled, stepping back and picking up her coffee. "Now, fry that bacon. I have a feeling we're going to need the energy today. That snow looks mean." The transaction was dead. The partnership had begun. The whiteout started on a Tuesday and didn't stop for 4 days. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed over the tin roof, a high mechanical shriek that rattled the iron stovepipe and buried the cabin under drifts so deep Gideon had to climb out the small side window just to shovel the heavy oak door clear. Inside, the world shrank to 4 walls, the glowing belly of the stove, and the relentless, suffocating pressure of absolute isolation. Cabin fever was a tangible thing. It smelled like damp wool, wet dog, and wood smoke. For the first 2 days, the forced proximity